We are open. And that's wonderful because the theme for August last week and then closing out this week is really about up-leveling our consciousness and conscience. And that requires a lot of opening. That requires leading from the heart. That requires us to sometimes be in a little bit of messiness. Who's opened your heart and it's been a little bit of messy before, huh? It's par for the course when we do that. But this is the work that is needed in the world today. And this is why I am so blessed and grateful to be part of this unity movement who has always said we are leading from the heart, that we are leading in a way that is creating a unity in the world, that we are connected beings, that we understand that we are connected to each other, that we are connected to spirit, that we are deep expressions of spirit, but that unity doesn't always mean uniformity. And therein is the rub a little bit. You know, last week we talked a lot about that. And a lot about the need to be open to something new, to be open to being willing to learn and to change and to grow, to be willing to be open to curiosity, like what might that be like, or what could that be like, or why did that person do or say that? Being open to sort of just having a different way of being in the world and not necessarily taking things so personally, but yet at the same time engaging things. And finally, I said to us that we needed to be open to the ways in which systemic forms and structures like colonialism have created boxes that engender unconscious bias and toxic behaviors. Whew, somebody need to breath that through that. That's a lot. I know that those words have become really deep buzzwords in our culture. To even say them kind of fully loaded, but I really felt called to speak them out. I really feel called to speak them out because I think that we need to name them in order to understand them and in order to be able to transform them. Today we're going to be talking about setting boundaries as spiritual practice. And it's funny because there's been so much talk of boundaries in my life. There's so many different things. So I'm like, okay, Spirit, I hear you. And it's really interesting because when we think about boundaries, it can kind of just be these small little things, right? We're not talking about big issues like world peace or, all of these things like systems or, big kind of things that we think about as spiritual practices. But it's always in the small things where spirit is met. It's always in the small things that we do or don't do that really keep us from higher spiritual living. Let me ask you all, are you ready for higher spiritual living? I know that I am. And just because I'm your minister doesn't mean I'm perfect. I know that's hard for y'all to believe. I am not perfect either. I am learning all of this too. We are in community and in community learning all of these things. Part of boundary setting is not really my forte. It's something that I'm learning to do. I grew up as someone in a household that, we didn't really have a lot of talk about what it meant to have boundaries. And so as I got older and started to, was in college and started to sort of read a lot and study a lot and then do therapy and then learn that I really needed to establish boundaries in my life and with my family. And that was really hard because when you step out of a system and you establish boundaries, the rest of the people that are still in that cycle are not ready to change. Anybody been there? They're like, but wait a minute. You were the classic codependent. What happened? We need you, codependent. Any codependents in the house? Ooh, ooh. So as a classic codependent, it was really hard for me to be able to do that. Part of the other issue for me was growing up in a culture where I looked different and acted different and was told that that difference was not enough. So I remember when I started as a Unity professor back in the 90s and early 2000s, when I was a Unity professor, my grandmother told me at the time, I remember telling me, you know, mija, you gotta buy new clothes. And I was like, okay, that's good. Yes, this is starting good. And she said, but you have to make sure that when you're in the classroom that you looked perfect every time. Because if you look perfect, there's less of a chance that you will be judged and there will be bias against you for being Mexican. And that was kind of a shock to hear from my grandmother, that she thought that I needed to look a certain part or be a certain way. But the reality is those of us who come from certain backgrounds, and it doesn't mean just people of color, it could be women, it could be a lot of different things. We have been taught, whether we realize it or not, that we have to do more and be more to be accepted. That we can't just be humdrum usual, that we have to go above and beyond to be accepted or at least to be acknowledged. And so that leaves us in a quandary. It left me in a quandary with all of these things even recently coming to light, all of these subconscious specters that I had in my life about needing to be and do more, that who I was not enough. And part of getting sick recently, part of having this Bell's palsy for me was really a challenge to kind of call the question on those things and say, I need to say no. I need to rest. I need to be okay with setting these boundaries and not feel guilty about it and not feel shamed about it and not feel anxious about it and just be okay that I don't have to push myself so hard and that I don't have to always respond to the demands of everyone. The definition of a boundary by abuse counselor Pia Melody in her book, Facing Codependence, she refers to boundaries as symbolic force fields that allow you to have a sense of yourself. So boundaries become these protective factors, like even in that graphic, right? Boundary setting is a spiritual practice. We have that barrier where the water is coming in, that big wave, that big tide, right? And it's kind of blocking it off so that you're encased in this safety. It's very important. We don't think about boundaries as a spiritual practice often, but they are. Because if we're not careful about setting boundaries, we're not just creating situations for us emotionally and physically, we're really tearing away at parts of our soul. It becomes important that we know this is me, this is not me. Or maybe this is me, oh shoot, this is really who I should be. Anybody feeling me on that? We have to take into account where we're at, and we'll talk about that shortly, about taking stock. But boundary setting is about spiritual development. Tina D'Amore of Three Crows Healing says the following, and I love what she says. Enforcing your boundaries is an act of sovereignty and self-protection. It's the biggest act of self-love you can do for yourself. When we say yes, when we're really feeling like saying no, our energy gets sucked out or even leaked out. Do you notice that when you say yes to something you really don't want to do, anybody been there? You feel twice as drained after. Boundaries are simply the conscious understanding and ability to speak to what feels comfortable for you and what does not. It is an act of respect for that comfort level for self, which overshadows the discomfort of potentially letting someone down. Speaking your truth about what feels okay and what doesn't feel okay is actually a huge act of protection on the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual planes. Listen to your intuition. Check in with how you feel and speak up. It is okay to say no and to refrain from pleasing everyone. As you practice this, it gets easier. How y'all feeling about that? Anybody have boundary issues? Yeah. Just one person and me? Okay, yeah. Stop lying, y'all. Y'all know you got boundary issues. It's really interesting, though, in unity and in New Thought, because we're talk about oneness all the time, right? So part of what we do, I think, is that we think that it's not okay to establish boundaries because we're advocates of oneness. Like, okay, I can't, like, everything's good, everything's God, like, I'm seeing the Christ in this person, right? That we need to be nice and we need to be tolerant and compassionate and giving. And guess what? All that is true, y'all, but it does have limits. How do you hold oneness but allow for personal dignity and respect? Well, I'm going to share something with y'all from Philip Moffitt, who was an author, teacher, and creator of a website called Dharma Wisdom. And I love what he has to say. He addresses this exact issue. In my observation from leading meditation and yoga retreats around the country, poorly defined or inappropriate behaviors are the cause for much suffering. And that suffering is compounded for some people by confusion regarding the teachings of oneness, selfness, and non-separateness. If you're struggling with these questions, you're in good company. After all, you're part of a culture that isn't clear about boundaries. Moreover, your sense of them changes dramatically as you mature and your spiritual life deepens. Even if you've done a lot of spiritual work, you may still allow others to violate your boundaries, or you may violate those of others. You may know people who chronically disrupt boundaries but have never realized it, or worse, deny it. You may even be enabling their behavior. Fortunately, you can have dramatically improved in this area through conscious practice, honesty, and patience. He's saying that boundaries are hard for us as human beings. And he's flagging the fact of what I said last week, that we're steeped in a culture that we sometimes don't even realize it has such a deep impact in us. The boxes that we put ourselves in, the kind of remnants of colonial mentality that have us thinking that we may not have a right to our physical and emotional selves. You know, for a long time in this country, people didn't have a right to their physical selves. We're talking about certain populations, or, for example, women or people of color. You didn't have the right to your own person. So why would you have the right to your emotions? Some people had no rights, and that includes emotions. Sometimes we forget that. We think because we've modernized, we think because we have changed, because political practice has changed, and laws and rules and cultural mores have changed, that we don't carry some of these things in the recesses of our mind, and yet we do. How about economic systems? Let's think about our economic systems that push us beyond our capabilities at times, that tell us that we need to do more or be more or give more in order to be worthy. These are true whether we realize it or not, that we define ourselves by these standards, so much so that when we retire, for example, many people have a hard time because they're not in that rat race. They've been conditioned to think that this is who I am, this is my identity. Who am I without this? Did y'all know that a lot of people that retire either die shortly after retirement or commit suicide? Did y'all know that? Who's about to retire? Oops. I mean, these are statistics I'm giving you as well that is showing us. How about cultural things? So not just economic things. I heard someone say the other day that Southerners were good at being polite at the expense of being truthful. Anybody resonate with that? That might be true for Southerners, but I would say that's true for a lot of other people too, where we are not wanting to call the question on things, where we are not wanting to speak our truth, where we're then don't do it and we fester and we become angry and we become bitter and we become in the shadows doing all of these kinds of toxic things because we're not willing to use our voice to speak up and say, I'm hurt. This is not okay. This is what I need from you. We have to learn how to speak and set boundaries. In the New Testament, Ephesians 6:12 really tells us why it's hard to set boundaries. It says, "For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places." Whew, sounds ominous, right? But let's take that metaphysically. It's saying what we've already been talking about, what we've talked about in the past, that all of these enemies, all of this evil is really our limiting thoughts, our thoughts of lack and limitation, the thoughts that we put on ourselves and on others that limits them and who they are and who they can be as expressions of the Christ. And so Ephesians reminds us that we have to do that work of uncovering what is lurking in the dark, what is unseen and unspoken, so that we can heal and that we can step mightily, boldly, radically, unapologetically into our Christ power. Who'd like to do that? Jesus was the master boundary setter. Think about all he did. He's all about self-care, going to the mountains, going away alone to pray, taking naps, resting, taking times with friends and being in joy, like when he went to the house of Mary and Martha. He was all about saying no. He wasn't always nice, y'all. You remember that? He was maybe in his definitely compassion and love, but he wasn't afraid to call it like it was, like with the money changers in the temple. He would say no to inappropriate behavior, especially when he saw authorities trying to impose inappropriate realities, ideals, punishments, behaviors on others. No. He said no to those who wanted his help without wanting to do their part. He's like, no, this is a co-creation here. I'm supporting and facilitating your journey. I am not healing you. It is your work. He said no when they were trying to manipulate or bait him. So he just would step out of that struggle. He would step out of that toxic dance, like when he was playing in the sand when they tried to bait him around the woman caught in adultery. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 37, it said that Jesus said, "Simply yet let your yes be yes and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." What is he saying? Again, the boundaries, it's yes or no. And once you make that decision, there should be no wavering. You have to be clear about who you are. You have to step into the decisions without excuses, without guilt, without shame, without sorries, because we shouldn't have to say sorry when we're being honest about what hurt us or telling the truth of our lives. So I'm going to give you 3 quick practices to start kind of getting the wheels turning around some of this boundary setting in your life. You want some practices? The first is this, and they come actually from an online blogger named Erin Johnson. I found this article and I thought it was so brilliant. She says, first you have to figure out what your boundaries are. Anybody have no clue what my boundaries are? Like, I don't know. See, thank you. Some people said yes. Thank you for being honest. How do you know which boundaries you need to set? How do you even know when your boundary has been violated? Well, practice checking in with your feelings. things we don't always do. Boundary violations will manifest by making you feel powerless or confused or drained or dissociated or angry or upset. When you feel that way, you have to take an honest look and ask yourself why. Did someone treat you in a way that was hurtful or unacceptable to you? Did you perform free emotional labor that's leaving you drained? Who's got to be the hearing ear every time to your friend or family? Whew, got you drained? Are you speaking to yourself in ways that are hurtful? Do you remain silent and resentful? Are you avoiding conflict? Second, dig in and look at why you may be struggling to set up your boundaries. Start questioning, what did you learn as a child about the importance of being liked, of going with the flow and saying yes? What did you learn as a child about saying and hearing no? Why am I afraid? What am I afraid of that will happen if I set and stick to clear boundaries? This came to me right now. I remember there's a number of people that I've met in my life who actually have lived with their physical, emotional, or sexual abusers as adults. And I always found that so mind-blowing because it was obvious that that was what had happened and there was no transformation, there was no healing around that, and yet they were living with that same person. I remember one woman who lived with her abuser, her sexual abuser as a child, and grew up, had her children growing up in that same household. And I always thought, wow, what must that be like if we can't set a boundary? Can you imagine waking up every day in that house? I can't, but it's not for me to judge. But this is what I'm talking about. So many times we don't question these boundaries. We just accept them as is, but we must start asking ourselves those questions if we are to be in a spiritual life, if we are to be in a life that is fulfilling and joyous, if we are to get out of a depression and addiction and hell, we have to start asking. Lastly, we must communicate clearly. You can speak your boundaries with love and compassion, again, without apologizing, feeling guilty, or making them feel optional. Be as clear, honest, and direct as you can. Set that boundary clearly with yourself first before you can communicate it to anyone. And here's what I'm going to tell you. You can set that boundary for yourself, and you can go and share that with someone else, and guess what might happen? They're going to send you to the moon. They're not going to maybe care about that. So you have to be prepared that this is for you. You have to be unwavering in what that boundary means for you in your physical, emotional, and spiritual self. And I encourage everyone to pray and to meditate and affirm around this if boundaries are something that you're working on. And we can even use our 12 power of power that we did in May, the color purple, the throat chakra, that's allowing us to be able to open up and speak into the truth of our lives. I'm going to move to close, reminding you all about boundaries. And this comes again from Aaron Johnson. Boundaries are an important way of setting the terms for how it is and isn't okay for other people to interact with you. And on an energetic level, they're a way of protecting your own energy. Because spiritual work, my dear friends, isn't pretty all the time. Sometimes it's the deep, unglamorous work of digging into the roots of your own heart and seeing what you truly need and then telling people no. So we have this today. And I think part of what I want to share with you as I move to close, and I feel called to share this with you, is my own boundary setting. As I said, this has been a time for me of deep learning and introspection. And I know that things in spiritual communities, as we've already said, can get messy. And sometimes it's that messiness that calls us to higher purpose and understanding. It's within that messiness that God is, and God boldly and mightily shows up. I also know that within this, there are currents around, I'll just call the elephant in the room, that may not always be happy with me as being the senior minister of this church. There's a lot of criticism that is against me at times, more than people can ever even imagine. I've often talked about what's outside of these walls, but the level of scrutiny within these walls can at times be paralyzing. And so part of what I'm suggesting today is that we take stock of what our boundaries are as a community. And it could be that maybe Senior Minister Reverend Christina Garza is not for Unity of Nashville, and I'm okay with that. I love this community, I love Nashville, and I love doing spiritual work, so that is not gonna change. Nashville's home now. I'm going nowhere, y'all, whether I'm here or not. But I want everyone to understand that we have to move past this idea that unity is only one way. I spoke last week about unity not being uniformity. And I know this is going to be really hard. Take a deep breath, y'all. Say, I'm ready and open. I'm ready and open. Because I really am putting my heart out here, and I need y'all to hear this. A lot of the things that I have experienced here have been things about unconscious bias. There are things that I have been subjected to that a man, and I definitely know a white man, would not be. I have been yelled at. I have been called a liar. I have had things happen behind the scenes where people are plotting against me. Okay, that might be with other ministers too. But many things. I've had people who have told me to my face, which I appreciate, because I can appreciate somebody who will come to my face and say something, who I was deeply friends with, who said to me that one of the reasons they had to leave was because I spoke about being a lesbian too much. That kind of shocked me. And recently I was thinking about this. Do you all know that I've given 75 sermons about since I've been here? That shocked me. Wow, I can't believe 75. 3,000 approximate minutes, 50 hours, and maybe 10 minutes of those were talking about that. I want people to know I'm not politicizing an issue. I'm just talking about my life. I am a lesbian, y'all. Did you not know that? I have a wife. She's not here today. I am not politicizing my life. This is not aimed at anyone. I want you to understand, because if I had $1 for every time I heard something that was hurtful to me, that to me was so against unity principle, I would have some Manolo Blahniks or some really nice luxury shoes, because that would be a whole thing that I would have. It's not aimed at anyone. And I have to set the boundary that you can have an idea about what unity is or isn't, but we have to expand beyond that. Church has changed. This country has changed. And if you are dead set on staying the unity that you were when you first came here, the unity will be dead soon. Hear me when I tell you that. You need to start preparing yourself to become death doulas. I am a researcher at heart. I was a researcher and professor at the university level many moons ago. And so everything I do is with an eye for data. Check your data. Everything that I have done in this church has been data informed. It may be uncomfortable for some people. It may seem like it's not on trend, but it's something that needs to be spoken. It's something that needs to be seen. It's something that needs to be felt. I didn't do it just because I liked it. It just happened to be I kind of like a lot of it. But it is research informed. And one thing I just want to close by saying, I really can't have people making comments about my appearance anymore. I can't have people saying that it's too much. Because who gets to determine and decide that? Who is the arbiter of what is appropriate? I have been told that it is distracting what I wear. I have been told that it is not ministerial. I have been told that it's too fancy. I have worked hard to get where I am, to be okay with who I am and how I publicly present, and I will not make that an exception anymore. So I suggest that my gender, racialized body is not up for public display, public objectification, or public comment. This is my body, and I ask that you respect my right to choose it to show up as the divine in the way I choose. You all are my spiritual family. And if I want to come on a Sunday at 10 a.m. with a full sequin dress, I'm going to do it. And you don't have to. I love that we are unity that can allow. Don't we say that every Sunday? That you show up as the divine, the many ways to the divine, the many ways the divine shows up. Does that only mean for you all and not for me? I hope not. I want us to be able to understand who I am and who you are, because that is a good boundary that we need moving forward in the discussions in the weeks to come as I may or may not sign my new contract. Because I have to be clear about what is not happening for me and how maybe we all are acting or enacting our conditioning, and how maybe all of us are in our defensive suffering. This community has the opportunity to do things that we have never seen or never dreamed of. I believe that with every fiber of my being. I left my family, my nice paying job, my daughter, my mother, my community, my friends, because I believed in that vision. And I cannot do it by myself. So I'm asking everyone, if this is your vision, then it's time to stand up. It's time to step forward. It's time to be able for us together to be able to not let energies that are not in that vibration to be able to be the conveners, the conveyors, and the controllers of the message. That's all I got, y'all. And so it is. Amen.